Good morning. Welcome to Houston Oasis, Houston's very own secular community. So today we have an exciting program. We have the Corey Wilson duo. Corey Wilson should be coming. And we have Richard and CB Forbes giving us a talk about stories from Alcoholics Anonymous.
When I heard that Richard was going to give a talk about the stories of Alcoholics Anonymous, I approached him and said, I would like to kick your talk off with my own personal story. There's a lot of confusion about AA, there are a lot of untruths about AA, and hopefully I can set a few things straight, and I know Richard will do even more so. If this were a normal meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I've addressed hundreds over my years, I've been sober over 40 years, I would have begun with, my name is CB and I'm an alcoholic. And so I'll start with that today. I believe I'm standing here today because of the assistance I got, the help I got, and what I learned through practicing the AA program in my life. I began drinking at 15. All I can remember about that first drink was that I absolutely hated the flavor, the taste. But once it hit my stomach, I loved the feeling. And I felt like for the first time in my life, I could breathe. I was from a very fundamentalist family where alcohol was pronounced as alcohol. And someone who drank was someone who drank, yeah, with a sneer. So I began drinking when I was in high school, and I found it very easy to get a hold of alcohol. I had a job, I had a car, and my parents lived 9 miles from where I went to school and from where I worked. So I had a lot of freedom for a 15, 16 to 18-year-old kid. And I was always able to find someone who, for either a beer or a six-pack, would buy me a fifth. And I kept a small bar under the back seat of my car. That went on through college. And my drinking was still sporadic until I got out of college and joined the Army. And at that point, I could finally become a almost daily drinker, which I did. As I continued to live my life, and had a lot of good times, by the way, my drinking progressed to the point that I began losing touch with even having a life. And I began living for what would happen after the job when I could go out to a bar and I could party. I was living in Chicago at the time. This was the 70s and the 80s and the rock and roll, and it was just a party all the time. But I failed to notice that I began to lose my discernment of where I was. I would go out to have a drink, I'd have 10. I'd go out and I'd say, I'm going to be home by 8 o'clock because I have to work tomorrow. I'd close the bar at 2 o'clock. And if any of you have ever closed a bar at 2 o'clock in the morning when the lights suddenly come on, it's not pretty. It is really not pretty. I don't recommend it. I maintained a life of anger, resentment, and fear. And I was able to mask all that with my alcohol. I was generally considered a very affable person. When I finally got sober, long-term friends of mine said, but you're always so much fun. Yeah, drunk. But I also changed jobs at a whim. I had a permanent resentment against any authority. And somehow or another, though it took me 12 years, I did get a degree, which opened a lot of doors for me. And I went from, management to computer programmer to sales rep to, oh gosh, I can't even remember all the work that I did. I finally wound up being happy as a bartender. I was in my element. But thanks to some contrivings in my family with my mother and a cousin, I had moved back to Texas, and I found out that I was qualified to teach a vocational program. So in 1981, I was teaching at Brazosport High School in Freeport, Texas, and drinking. And every day after work, I would buy a six-pack of tall boys, because that's what it took me to get to Houston so I could finally do some real drinking in a bar. The last week of my drinking, I want to tell a little story. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I remember looking up at the clock, and it was 4 o'clock. And I thought, good, I've got lots of time. Immediately, I was standing in front of my 8 o'clock class at 8:30 in the morning in Brazosport High School, almost 70 miles south of Houston. My apartment was in Angleton. Without any recollection, I had stopped, I had shaved, I had bathed, I had changed clothes. But the most frightening thing of all was at 8:30, I came to the realization that I was in that classroom and had been saying something to my students and hadn't the slightest idea what I had been saying. That's called a blackout. They happen more and more frequently. I've had a lot in my life. A little side story, I have a friend who's an attorney, a big attorney in Houston. I met him through AA. He was drinking in Houston one night and woke up in Spain. He knew no one in Spain, he had no connections in Spain, and it was 3 days later. And he said, I still don't have the fuck how I got to Spain. So those things happen, and they're very, very real stories. By the end of that week, I came to the realization that I was facing two choices in my life. I could get help with my drinking because I finally got through my denial enough that I recognized that alcohol was causing me the problems. Or I could die. Those were the two choices. I was 41 years old. Everything I owned, I could put in the back of a 10-year-old pickup with room to spare. I slept on a mattress on the floor. I believed in being mobile. I was a hippie, ready to go in a minute. And so I'd done nothing with my life. But I went to AA because it had been recommended by a woman who I respected. Now, I'm gay, and so I went to the gay AA club in Houston. For your information, it's called Lambda. It's the second largest AA club in the country, has over 1,000 members. And among those memberships are a whole variety of thinking. So when I showed up and very quickly declared myself an atheist, I found people who were not hostile to me. But I also found people who made a point of telling me, you get God or you won't get sober. So I had the two contrasts. I arrived an atheist, I'm still an atheist, and when someone says it now, I tell them, dear, when you have 40 years sober, you can come tell me that again. But I want to tell you a little bit, because there are a lot of misconceptions about AA. There is something called 12 steps. And these 12 steps are a suggested plan of recovery. Emphasis on suggested. There's only one thing that I was told at the very beginning that AA would guarantee me. If I didn't take a drink, I wouldn't get drunk. That's the only guarantee I was ever given in that program. And at first, the steps were daunting, but I found people who were amenable to how I thought and showed me ways to think that I could work these steps, which are basically attitude changes. For example, I wrote down some. I'd like to go through a few of them. God is used in the steps, became good orderly direction, group of drunks, or whatever to me provides me with, whatever or whomever provides me with an answer I need to not take the next drink. That's my higher power. It might be you. It might be a race. It could be anything. And it has been over the years. They practice prayer. Prayer for me, I was encouraged. Prayer for me became meditation. There was something called a moral inventory. They suggested you take a moral inventory of your life. That just became honesty, being really honest with myself. In terms of making amends, I was told by a dear lady who has passed on, who helped me so much the first few years, that everything I was going to be given to save my life and change my life would be given to me free. The only obligation I had was to give back to someone else what had been given to me. She meant so much to me. Anyway, she lovingly guided me through the principles. And those principles very, very, very slowly changed my life. It changed how I thought. It changed how I reacted. You know, I still have what they call character defects. I call it, what did I call it? Something, character. Biggest one of mine is probably anger. And he lies over in the corner. He's a nice guy. Just every now and then give him a stroke. Every now and then he'll raise his head and go, "Shh." You know, and I know what it is, and I just say, not today. You know, my flaws never go away. I don't expect them to. However, I have learned to live with them and manage them. When I sobered up, the only option was AA that I was aware of. Today, there are a lot of options. Richard will talk about some of that. There is something called smart recovery. I've forgotten how many. There is mostly now, the biggest thing is secular AA. About 10 years ago, these groups began to pull off regular AA and form their own secular AA in which God was not even mentioned. And some of the things I talk about was what they talked about. It's the same thing. It's the same group of drugs. And any recovery program that I have looked at and investigated involves the group. It involves the group who have this. Anytime you have a group of people who experience the same problem and who have learned how to recover from that problem and are there to assist other people do the same thing, that is the principle of every program, whatever it is. I've yet to find one that didn't involve the group, including online programs. A few years ago, I was at a meeting, a secular meeting, and I met a man from Seattle. He was driving to Florida. I remember his mother was sick or something. She lived in Florida. And he told me that he was able to make a secular AA meeting every day of his trip across the United States. That's how much it has grown. There is a website called aaagnostica.org. Richard knows about it. We've talked about it. That lists all the secular groups in North America, including Canada, Mexico. I think they even have some international groups. It's the largest growing element of AA. But I want to give full credit to AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. It saved my life, and I've seen it save many, many, many other lives. In case you don't know, it was the first self-help program ever that we're aware of which nothing was asked but just try these simple steps, the simple programs, and give back. So that's my story. I want to tell you one last thing I learned. There's a lot of work, by the way, in learning to live sober if you've really messed up your life. So I'm not going to pat myself on the back, but I did a hell of a lot of work. We have a saying that I learned that I really like. Sober up a drunk horse thief, and what do you have? Does anybody know? You've got a horse thief, you know? And it's the horse thief who has to change. Thank you very much. I think we're going to take a break now.
All right, everyone. We'll have our main talk now by Richard Andrews. Richard is also no stranger to this gathering. He's been one of our go-to doctors during the pandemic and before as well. He's going to talk to us about our main talk today, which is stories of of Alcoholics Anonymous. And Richard, please go ahead.
So hello, and hello again hello also to the people out there in TV land, or I guess they call it online these days. So I was never in TV land, but I wanted to say that. Okay, so make no mistake about it, the real expert on AA, of course, is the one you heard from earlier, CB, and we've got a couple other people here who were in recovery programs of one kind or another, or still are in recovery programs. So I have no experience with being in a recovery program. I am an addiction doctor at this point. So a couple of things we'll talk about today is, one of the things I wanted to emphasize, and I think you have a sense of this already, but it's easy to forget sometimes when talking about recovery programs, including AA. AA, of course, is just one recovery program. Is this can be a life or death issue for a lot of people. There are a few people who only have mildly uncontrolled drinking or other substance use who get into recovery programs, and that's nice, but for a huge number of people going into recovery programs, they really think of it as a life and death issue, and it really is a life and death issue, so it's important that we get it right as a society. I also have an interest in the topic because my own father, also Ted's father, my brother here, had an issue with alcohol, shall we say, and was often referred to as an alcoholic. Of course, in the medical field, we don't use the word alcoholic anymore, and we talk about use disorders, such as alcohol use disorder, a more cumbersome term than something like alcoholic or drunk. But of course, it reminds us that this is not something that completely characterizes the individual. It's a condition that they have and that they can deal with. A lot of my information came from a book that came out in 2019 called Writing the Big Book. Those of you who are already familiar with AA may have heard about the so-called Big Book, which is not the official name. It is, the title of the book it's actually a long title, and we'll see that later, but the short title is Alcoholics Anonymous. And it was then really, when that book came out in 1939, that was when the organization, which was a fledgling organization at that point, and the meetings themselves started to be called Alcoholics Anonymous. And there's a podcast, which if you're interested in the subject, and apparently you are because you're here, There's a fascinating podcast called Beyond Belief Sobriety, which I highly recommend. Beyond Belief is a reminder that that's a secular-oriented podcast, and there's well over 200 podcasts. They're about 40 minutes long, absolutely fascinating. And if you enjoyed CB's stories this morning, and I use the word story deliberately because storytelling is what these recovery programs are all about, as CB suggested, then you'll love this podcast and you'll learn a lot, as I have. AA by the numbers, it's huge. It's got about 2 million members, and that's just people who are actively attending or have attended recently. The actual number, I'm sure, is more than that. It's in 180 countries. It's free. People are asked to donate, I think mostly to the coffee fund, correct me if I'm wrong, CB, and rent, yeah. Of course, any payment is voluntary. A lot of people, when they first get into either AA or another recovery program, are not in a position to be giving money to anything. Some of the important dates for those of you that are history buffs, and I think this is important for context, 1920 to 1933 was the era of the alcohol prohibition. That's a fascinating period. Alcohol was not quite prohibited, even though it was called prohibition. What they did was you couldn't transport it across state lines, and you couldn't not pay taxes on it, on the production of it, and that kind of stuff. Every American during the Prohibition era actually was allowed to make their own alcohol and have up to, I think it was 100 gallons per year or something like that. A lot of people don't know that. But it was only the wealthy, of course, that had these basically cellars full of alcohol, and the average person could not do that. So for the average person, it was not really available alcohol. What always happens during any prohibition is the drug becomes more potent because it's easier to smuggle a small amount of a potent substance than a larger amount of a weaker substance. And so beer was actually the most popular alcoholic beverage before Prohibition, but during Prohibition, of course, it became whiskey and bourbon and things like that. So that's one of the consequences of Prohibition. Shortly after, maybe even because of the Prohibition era, no, I don't think so, but shortly after that, the Great Depression began, and so the main founder of AA was a guy named Bill Wilson. We'll hear about him, and he got sober in 1934, and so that was 6 years after the Prohibition ended and smack in the middle of the Great Depression. So he was in a hospital which specialized in detoxifying people with alcohol use disorder. So he was in there for his third detox, and he was in trouble. He was spiraling downhill. He had gotten fired. He had been a stockbroker. Of course, the Great Depression is not a great time to be a stockbroker anyway, but also when you've got an alcohol problem, it makes it harder to keep your job and that kind of stuff. So he was spiraling downhill, and he had a kind of spiritual awakening, as he called it, when he was in the hospital for his third time. And this was, I say hospital, it was it was like a retreat almost for wealthy people, honestly. But there was a doctor there who was genuinely interested not only in your money, but he was interested in how do you help people with alcohol and trying to be at least a little bit scientific about it and stuff like that. It was really the dawn of the era of regarding alcoholism and by extension other substance use disorders as a condition that could be treated, that could be managed. It wasn't just a moral failing, in other words, which of course, even today, we still have a lot of that attitude. But this was the beginning of a changing attitude there. In 1935, about a year after he had had his own recovery, he met a doctor named Bob Smith in Akron, Ohio, And he was there on a business trip. He had gotten a job, an East Coast job, because he was from the New York area. And Bill Wilson went out there, and he was supposed to close the deal. And the deal fell through, which meant that his job was in danger. And he was trying to decide whether to go to a church or whether to go to the bar. And he was literally walking back and forth near the hotel. Should I go to the church or should I go to the bar? And he decided that the only way to avoid him going to the bar was to go help another alcoholic. He had some contacts in Akron, so he used his contacts there to to meet with this guy, Bob Smith, who was having a lot of trouble with his medical practice because he was an alcoholic. And so that is said to be the first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, which at that time was not called Alcoholics Anonymous. It didn't have a name. That was just the first time that these two individuals and those that followed had a one-on-one meeting with each other to try to help somebody recover from alcohol. And Bill Wilson, I've already mentioned. We'll hear a little bit more about him. A central figure, I would say the central figure for the history of Alcoholics Anonymous. He was, as we all are, a flawed individual, and he would be the first one to say so. In fact, he did say that a number of times, because people later on, as Alcoholics Anonymous got quite popular, he resisted the sanctifying of him, saying that, you know, we are not saints, you know, and if you knew anything about us, you would know that we are definitely not saints. And but he was a flawed individual, but I think he genuinely wanted to help every single drunk in the world. And this is why he incorporated into some of the structure of AA, or at least the philosophy of AA, the notion that AA needs to be there to reach out to any drunk anywhere in the world at any time to help out. And that is incorporated in what CB mentioned as sort of the service component of AA. You know, somebody helps you and then you help somebody else. And in that helping of somebody else, it helps us. Lois Wilson was his wife. She wasn't involved directly in necessarily the writing of the big book and the other stuff, but I think Bill wouldn't have survived without her. And they were living in what was effectively her house because it came from her side of the family. And eventually they were kicked out of the house because Bill couldn't hold a job, and he was basically obsessed with AA. And they would have, and again, this was before it was called AA. This was in the New York area, because there were two centers of early AA, New York and Akron, and they were very different in terms of their personalities. And in this house, they would have drunks basically stopping by at any time, wanting help because they had heard that this was a place they could go to get help, and they would be fed, they would be housed. I mean, it was an extraordinary logistical effort. And that's where the meetings would take place. But a person with alcohol issues could stop by at any time, and they knew they would be assisted there. Hank Parkhurst is an interesting, very interesting individual, also central to the writing of the big book and to the early formation. Oh, sorry. Oh. Look, oh, I see. It shows me the current one and the next one. All right, I'll get this figured out. So Hank Parkhurst was basically agnostic, or perhaps a deist, but he, because Bill Wilson Bill Wilson was what I would call a quasi-religious figure. He was not a standard Christian, certainly by any means. In fact, I think he was basically an agnostic before he had his spiritual awakening. But his spiritual awakening was brought to him by people in the Oxford group, which we'll talk about also. And they were extremely religious. The Oxford group was started by a former Lutheran minister who got tired of the Lutheran Church and almost started his own religion, really, in some ways. And but it was a friend of his, a former drinking buddy, who was in the Oxford group, who came to him while he was in the hospital and said, here's how you get out of it, and you follow this program and that kind of stuff. And so what we think of as the AA program, huge components of that basically were lifted directly from the Oxford group. And that included a heavy God component. But because of two of the figures that you see on this page, at least I hope you do, Hank Parkhurst and Jim Burwell were not religious. Jim Burwell was very vocal about it and made no bones about the fact that he was an atheist, and he ridiculed religion openly all the time, which of course was not well received by the more religious people in the group. Whereas Hank Parkhurst was not quiet about many things, but I think he was at least not so vocal about his non-religiousness. But he really wanted to incorporate some of the emerging scientific ideas about alcoholism and whatnot that are by definition secular. They rely on a scientific understanding rather than a religious understanding. And it was because of these two figures primarily that Bill actually toned down the God language, which would have been even stronger in the big book if it hadn't been for these two figures. And so they incorporated language such as God as you understand him. And there were a few other places in the book where they said, look, don't get hung up on the God thing. You can call that whatever you want. It is certainly not a Christian book, because the word Christ, as far as I know, never appears in the big book. It talks about God a lot, but it's kind of vague about it, and you can make it anything you want to. I saw a quote from Bill Wilson saying, look, you can call it the 14th Avenue bus if you want to. I don't really care, But the idea was a higher power, but they also said a higher power, as CB noted, can be almost anything. It can be the group. And as CB also said, God was sometimes interpreted as group of drunks. In other words, this group, in fact, one of the amazing things about recovery groups, including AA and others, is, it has to do with support from your peers, right? People who have experienced the same thing, people who speak the same language, and that support is absolutely invaluable and can be certainly invaluable to recovery. It's not important for everybody, because there are people who recover on their own. There are a lot of people who recover on their own, actually. In fact, one of the amazing things about addiction, which is not well understood by so many people, is that addiction is considered one of the mental health disorders, shall we say, or conditions, or situations, if you prefer. But the prognosis for addiction is actually better than for virtually any other mental health disorder. That's pretty amazing when you think about it. Most people, their addiction will stop at a certain point. Their brain changes, their circumstances change, whatever. Now, the important thing is to keep people alive in the meantime. This is where harm reduction comes in. Because that's not to say that addiction always has a happy outcome. It often doesn't. And if the right kind of recovery isn't offered to people, if options aren't offered to people, then they may not survive to where they would have a good prognosis. But I'm just going by the numbers. The numbers for addiction writ large is that most people will recover. But again, we have to reach out. Ruth Hawk was, Bill dictated virtually every word of the big book, except for, I should say, the first half of the big book, because there's really two halves of the big book. There's the program, how you do it, and the second half is the stories. And the stories are critical. In fact, some people who don't really like the first half, they focus entirely on the stories. For them, the stories are everything, right? Because that, again, is peer support. But he dictated virtually every word of it to Ruth, who was typing it down, because she was the secretary for Hank Parkhurst's business. Hank Parkhurst had been a fairly high up Standard Oil executive, and until he lost his job, partly because of the depression and partly because of his alcohol issues. But I think she also provided some input to the book and gave Bill feedback on it and stuff like that. Now, the unfortunate thing with regard to Hank Parkhurst is that he was sober for a few years and then for various reasons went back to drinking, and because they were trying to popularize their program to everybody, they basically wrote him out of the history, which I think was terrible. And because how can you tell everybody that you've got a great program when one of your main founders went back to drinking? So he was, you know, his contribution is now being recognized more than it was for a long time. And so then Dr. Bob, of course, who was also central because he was very successful at recruiting alcoholics, but their program out in Akron was extremely religious because it was based on the Oxford group. But after Hank Parkhurst was dropped from the picture, like scrubbed out of with Photoshop or whatever, then Bob Smith's star became a little more prominent. So the Oxford group, extremely religious, extremely rigid. You can see the lovely sounding things that it was based on: honesty, purity, love, unselfishness. But you have to put the word absolute in front of all four of those. Absolute honesty about absolutely everything, publicly confessing your defects and stuff like that. Absolute purity. You can't do anything wrong. You know, it's a little unrealistic for humans, really. And half of their meetings would involve a meditative kind of thing where you would, kind of like the Quakers, I guess, where you'd spend half the meeting in quiet, listening to God, supposedly, and writing down what God said to you on a piece of paper so that you could share it with the group afterwards. That was called witnessing. But the witnessing, Bill Wilson noted, and he does credit Oxford Group for helping him and stuff like that, but this is where he felt that they really had to carve out a different path, because the witnessing would involve some busybody in the meeting, because they like to attract, the Oxford Group liked wealthy people, and in the middle of a depression, who doesn't like wealthy people, I guess? It would involve things like, you know, Bill, God told me that he wants you to go get a job on Wall Street, you know, so you can give money to the group and so that the group members are wealthy. And it was all kinds of nonsense, really. And so Bill, after a couple years of sobriety, Bill said, you know, we're doing our own thing now. And so the New York group became relatively more secular. The Akron group in Ohio, where Bob Smith was still rigidly Oxford group oriented and stayed that way for a while. And they were always, the people in Akron were always suspicious of New York because they'd come up with these non-Oxford group ideas. When Bill and Hank really didn't want to write the big book. They were hoping the book would sort of write itself and stuff like that. And so, basically 90% of that first half of the book was written by Bill. Hank Parkhurst wrote one chapter, and they were always trying to get the people in Akron to contribute to the book. And now what I'm telling you now is more recent information because it came from a deep dive into the archives. This is extremely well documented, and it's discussed in this book, Writing the Big Book, which came out in 2019. It's the most scholarly discussion of the origins of AA that has ever been written. This guy spent between 9 and 11 years diving into the archives, and there's a huge amount of correspondence between everybody and stuff like that. And so there's a lot of legends and myths in AA, but this is what's documented. The Oxford Group founder, I said a little bit about him. His dad was an alcohol wholesaler. He'd like to do one-on-one work with alcoholics, but not everybody in the Oxford Group liked that. In fact, the Oxford Group in Akron was mostly not about alcoholics. That was like a sideshow for them, and many of the people who were not alcoholics in the Oxford Group in Akron were kind of annoyed by this group of alcoholics. And they befriended, they did help with the sobriety of a rubber magnate's son, the Firestone group, and that got them a lot of money in Akron. Bill Wilson's background is quite interesting. And again, this is not in order to sanctify Bill Wilson, but perhaps to understand some of the origins of AA. His grandfather and dad were heavy drinkers. His grandfather in particular, they lived in Vermont near a mountain called Mount Aeolus. Aeolus comes from the ancient Greek word for wind. And his grandfather had a similar awakening on the top of Mount Aeolus, and he would describe it frequently to anybody who would listen. And even those who wouldn't listen, I guess he would describe it. And he would describe, for example, and then a great wind came up. Well, of course it did, because he was on the top of Mount Windy, you know. And so he was, Bill Wilson was, and then Bill's father never had such an awakening, never achieved sobriety. And so Bill's mother loved to recount the story of the grandfather going up and having this moment where he, achieved recovery. But it didn't quite work for Bill's dad. But Bill grew up hearing this story, including with the wind component. I mentioned the wind component because later, when Bill describes his own awakening in the hospital there, he talked about a great wind came up. He was in a hospital room. How could there be a great wind, right? But anyway, he discussed it that way because that was how he perceived it apparently. And he was fascinated by the ideas of William James, the so-called father of psychology, and he wrote a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience, which had a big influence on a lot of people. And it was basically comparative religion with psychological overlay. And it talked about how, a Muslim and a Buddhist and a Hindu and a Christian, that they were all kind of experiencing similar things. So obviously not something that your average evangelistic Christian is going to go for. But it influenced Wilson and Parkhurst, and even though there's a big God component, a nebulous God component in the big book, but some of the secular components that were creeping in, like God as you understand him, that came from the more secular influence of the other two people that I mentioned. William James's book and some of his ideas also influenced Margaret Sanger, who opened up the first birth control clinic in the country, W.E.B. Du Bois, Bertrand Russell, some of these other popular secular figures. I've talked a little bit about the difference between Akron and New York. Of course, AA was almost exclusively for men initially, but very quickly you started hearing from people who were not straight white males and who also wanted a resource for recovery. And so eventually AA developed so-called special interest groups. It seems funny with females in particular who are over half the human race that you would call them a special interest group, but there it is. And then these are a couple of the other books. I mentioned writing the big book already, which is the most recent, most scholarly work ever on the early history of AA. And then Ernie Kurtz, a fascinating figure, he wrote another earlier secular and scholarly work on AA. He was an ex-priest, actually, who later became secular. He was a big figure in the secular movement, and he wrote a book called Not God, A History of AA. And he also got a PhD in American history and taught at Harvard, etc. So they're both good books. They were always trying to get money, the early AA people, always trying to get money from rich people, and eventually they decided, okay, I guess we have to write a book. So they wrote 2 chapters, Bill did, and then they tried to rely on that to leverage the money that they wanted, and that didn't work basically after a lot of attempted leveraging. And so very reluctantly, they, mostly Bill again, wrote the rest of the book. Hank wrote 1 chapter, and it was very difficult to get anybody else to contribute. The people he was always writing to Bob Smith saying, we really would appreciate it if you guys would send in your stories and stuff like that. But Bob Smith probably wasn't even saying anything to the other to the other people in Akron because they were kind of suspicious of New York anyway because of being less rigid. What was in the alcohol? Here's the full title of the big book. The story of how more than 100 men have recovered from alcoholism. And they always had this magic round number of 100. Well, again, the archives show that there were never 100 men. And there were actually 1 or 2 women also, but they never reached 100 at that early stage. But it sounded like a nice number, right? If you're going to go around, Bill admitted that he was basically a salesman. That's what he was. And you have to look at everything he did from the point of view of this was what he did. And he wasn't that focused on accuracy of things and stuff like that. He wanted to sell the thing, and so that explains a lot. It actually, why was it called the big book? It wasn't all that big. But they chose for their first edition to choose a fancy, thick paper so that when people bought the book, they would think they were getting a better deal. That was why it was called the big book. And it has become among the best-selling books of all time. Let's see. So here's a few other resources. I know the print is probably too small there, but anybody who's interested in this presentation, by the way, you can write to me. My email is sciencelover@gmail.com, sciencelover@gmail.com, and I'll send you the presentation, and it's got links there and that sort of thing. Here's some more secular addiction resources, including if you use Facebook, there's a secular coffee shop on Facebook, both for AA and for NA. Now, NA is Narcotics Anonymous. The word narcotics is kind of like the word love or the word God. It means something different to everybody who uses the word. But basically, even though they do help people with other addictions besides alcohol, they also will help somebody with alcohol issues. That group started about 20 years after AA and was based on AA principles for the most part. Now, Smart Recovery, and we have a couple people over here, Beth and Charles, who are experts on Smart Recovery right here, and they've known CB for a long time. And in fact, I think Charles wrote a book on it, correct me if I'm wrong, which is widely used among incarcerated individuals and been sold in other countries and that kind of stuff. Smart Recovery is a flat-out science-based recovery thing which borrowed from AA, but remember, AA borrowed from the Oxford group and so on and so forth. Everybody, in fact, Bill Wilson said everything in the big book came from somewhere else, basically. And so, you know, the Smart Recovery is paid for by insurance generally. It's available in Houston. I'm sure Charles can tell you about it if you ask him afterwards. We don't have enough resources in Houston for people, and we need a lot more, and we need more secular options. And on Thursday nights, CB and I are going to be attending, I think it's on Thursday nights, right? There's a Midtown Humanist AA meeting, which I think it's 7 o'clock on Thursday nights, if I'm correct. And those are open meetings, so people can go to those, right? Sorry? At the Quaker Church. Okay, so check with him for those details. The Satanic Temple, you don't have to be a Satanist to take part in the Satanic Temple's secular recovery group thing, but that's there in case you're interested. And the good, the bad, and the ugly about AA, well, I think one of the good things about it is that it helped people recognize that there was not a moral component necessarily to alcoholism. And it highlighted the importance of mutual self-help structure, basically. The God talk is confusing. There's no question about it. It's not confusing for everybody. Some people like the God talk. Some people, like CB, are able to see their way around it and reframe it and so on and so forth. Written stuff, as we all know, with the Bible and other books like the Quran and whatnot, written stuff has a tendency among human beings to become dogma. And people do become dogmatists. And every AA meeting, Bill Wilson said that any two people who get together and want to call themselves an AA meeting can do that. As soon as you start talking to another person, and helping each other, that can be an AA meeting. It isn't necessarily an official AA group, which is something that you apply for. That's like the next level or whatever. But anybody can be an AA if they say they need help with alcohol, basically. And the basic program of AA, or any other recovery group, I would guess, but certainly AA, can be boiled down to 2.5 to 3 things. One is don't drink, go to meetings, help others. 3 things. Don't drink, go to meetings. I say 2.5 because some people, in fact, maybe most people when they first come into AA are in no position to help others. They can barely help themselves. That's why they're there. And so that's why the third one is kind of optional. If you're in a position to do so, help others. But you're not required really to do so. And by the way, it's therapeutic to help others. And the ugly part, the good, the bad, and the ugly part, as a good friend of mine told me a day or two ago, AA in some ways, by not always being open to people coming in who are non-traditional, may have blood on its hands in a way, because this is a life or death issue. So it's important that we have options for people who don't fit the traditional mold, whether it's secular people or trans or gay or black or what have you. We have to be able to help anybody who's reaching out. By the way, I've printed out, or actually my brother Ted printed out, alternate 12 steps. One of the things in the program for AA and a lot of other groups is 12 steps. There's nothing magic about the number 12, although people would tell you that there is. It's thought that Bill Wilson made it 12 so that it was similar to the 12 apostles. I think he denied that generally, but who knows? That's probably true. He was a salesman. And so here's a bunch of alternate 12 steps, some of them only one word each, and so you can take a look at that, and those are secular oriented. Let's see, what I find fascinating about AA and other recovery groups and in general mutual help self-support groups is that it's all about storytelling, and we're learning more. I've got some links in here, some information about ways in which storytelling affects us physiologically. It increases things like dopamine levels, which, by the way, is what many drugs do also. Oxytocin levels, the so-called cuddle hormone, although oxytocin has kind of a split personality and can also cause problems. And also cortisol levels. And so storytelling isn't just storytelling. It's the way we're built. I won't say it's the way we're designed, but it's the way we're built. And so I think it's an incredibly powerful thing. I encourage you, if you do decide to go listen to the Beyond Belief Sobriety podcasts, is listen to episode 61 in particular. There's an amazing storyteller there, an Irish. In fact, I keep seeing this Irish component. Of course, there's many people, many cultures that have good storytelling, but the Irish in particular love storytelling, and some of the best stories I've heard are from the Irish. Now, we have to be careful about storytelling also, the way you tell your story. Everybody that tells their story will talk about how they spiraled downhill and that kind of stuff, but some storytellers will also talk about how much they enjoyed their drinking or their drug or what have you. And I think you have to be cautious about that also, because there are some people, especially people for whom it's their first meeting or within the first 6 months or whatever, that can be triggering. And so that's something to be careful about. Here's some links again and stuff about storytelling and its power, and I guess that's the end of the show. So hopefully I didn't go too long, and I guess that's it, yeah. So thank you.
All right, Richard's probably given you his email, scienceflower@gmail.com, is it? You can email him for questions or talk to him after the talk, after this. I'd like to thank the volunteers and indeed the entire community for making Houston Oasis possible. Your donations also make this possible. Please donate in the back of the room. Will has the information there, or on houstonoasis.org/donate. Again, that site is houstonoasis.org/donate. You can also follow us on Facebook, Meetup, Twitter, or even TikTok now. Or also, you can join us on our private Facebook group by friending one of our existing members and asking them to invite you.